Can a small nation with a powerful neighbor shape its own destiny? The answer is a firm no if the small nation has a strategic importance associated with it. Welcome to the Why in History. I am Ajay Kaul, and today we are talking about Ukraine and Russia's aggressive stance towards its neighbor. A very happy new year to all our listeners. And at the outset, let me apologize for the sudden change in topic for this episode, but the recent developments in Ukraine necessitated the need for covering Ukraine in this episode. Geographically, Ukraine is considered Eastern Europe, and it is Russia's immediate neighbor on its eastern side. Overall, it covers an area of approximately 603,500 square kilometers with an estimated population of 43.87 million. Its capital is Kiev, and Ukrainians make up more than 3/4 of the population. There's a significant minority of Russians as well. And besides Ukrainian, which is the official language, other languages spoken are Russian, Romanian, Polish, Hungarian, etc. Now, there isn't any natural land border like a mountain range or rivers between Russia and Ukraine. And the two countries have been intertwined for about 1,000 years of tumultuous history. And Ukraine is one of Russia's biggest markets for natural gas, and it's a crucial transit route to the rest of Europe. Ukraine also is home to an estimated 7.5 million ethnic Russians who mostly live in eastern Ukraine and the southern region of Crimea. When you look at the modern 20th century history, Ukraine declared independence for a very short amount of time between 1918 and 1921. And in 1921, post the formation of Lenin's Bolshevik government in Russia, the Russian Red Army conquered 2/3 of Ukraine, making it the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, and the 1/3, which was the western 1/3, became part of Poland. During the 1932-33 famine of Holodomor, which was the result of Stalin's policy of collectivization, Ukraine was very severely hit, and of the estimated 5 million people who died in the Soviet Union, almost 4 million were Ukrainians. And the famine was a direct assault on the Ukrainian peasantry, which was continuing to resist collectivization. The Ukrainian grain harvest of 1932 had resulted in below average yields, partly because of the chaos wreaked by Stalin's collectivization, but it was more than sufficient to sustain the population. But the Soviet authorities set requisition quotas for Ukraine at an impossibly high level, and special agents were dispatched to Ukraine to assist in procurement, and homes were routinely searched and foodstuffs confiscated. A law was passed in August of 1932, making the theft of socialist property a capital crime, and this led to scenes in which peasants faced the firing squad for stealing as little as a sack of wheat from the state storehouses. The rural population was left with insufficient food to feed itself, and the ensuing starvation grew to a massive scale by the spring of 1933, but Stalin and Moscow refused to provide relief. In fact, the Soviet Union exported more than 1 million tons of grain to the West during this period. Seems very much in line with what Mao did a few decades later in China. The famine subsided only after the 1933 harvest had been completed, and actually the Ukrainian countryside was so destroyed that settlers from Russia were brought in to repopulate the devastated countryside. Not surprisingly, the Soviet authorities flatly denied the existence of the famine, both at the time it was raging and after it was over. It was only in the late 1980s that officials made a guarded acknowledgement that something had been amiss in Ukraine at this time. Along with the industrialization and collectivization drives, the Soviet regime also commenced a campaign of Russification of Ukraine. So essentially, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church was liquidated in 1930, and the clergy was arrested and exiled. And this was followed by the imprisonment, exile, or execution of key intellectuals, writers, and artists in Ukraine. And in all, about 4/5 of the Ukrainian cultural elite were silenced through the course of the 1930s. Now, fast forward to World War II, the Nazi invasion of Poland on September 1, 1939, marked the beginning of World War II. And by mid-September, in accordance with the German-Soviet non-aggression pact, most of the one-thirds Ukraine that was under Polish control was occupied by Soviet troops and soon officially got incorporated into the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. However, on June 22, 1941, Germany surprised the world with its invasion of the USSR, and by the end of November, virtually all of Ukraine was under German control. Now, during this period of occupation, from 1941 through 1944, more than 5 million Ukrainians died fighting Nazi Germany, and most of Ukraine's 1.5 million Jews were killed by the Nazis. And in 1944, once Russia was able to push back Germany from Ukraine, Stalin deported 200,000 Crimean Tatars to Siberia and Central Asia on the pretext that they were collaborators with Nazi Germany. Now, in 1954, after the death of Stalin, once Nikita Khrushchev was leading the Soviet Union, something interesting happened. The Crimean Peninsula, which had been part of Russia for ages, was gifted to Ukraine in 1954. Many Russians think that Khrushchev was drunk when he signed the treaty, but the true reason seems to be that he was trying to make amends for the Ukrainian famine. Actually, when Khrushchev took over from Stalin, he tried to be more conciliatory towards all those that had been affected by Stalin's policies. So it is possible that the main reason he gifted Crimean Peninsula to Ukraine was to make up for the losses, penalties, and mass starvations that Ukraine had faced under Stalin. And now, fast forward to 1991. Post the collapse of the Soviet Union, the population of Ukraine voted overwhelmingly for independence in the referendum of December 1, 1991. About 84% of eligible voters turned out for the referendum, and about 90% of them endorsed independence. Now, one important tragedy to remember with respect to Ukraine while it was part of the Soviet Union happened in 1986, and that was the Chernobyl nuclear disaster. And as a result of that, the anti-nuclear sentiment ran very high in Ukraine, and even prior to independence, Ukrainian leaders had committed themselves to divesting the country of any nuclear weapons. But what they were not aware of was the size of the nuclear arsenal on their soil. Ukraine was effectively the third largest nuclear power in the world post the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And after approximately half of the arsenal had been transferred to Russia by early 1992, the leaders of independent Ukraine began to question the wisdom blindly handing over the weapons to a potential adversary. Ukraine then expressed reservations about the complete removal of the weapons from the country before it could obtain some guarantees for its security, as well as some financial compensation for the dismantling and transportation of the warheads. Ukraine's economy at that time was not doing that well, so this was only going to help it. After a lot of back and forth and intense diplomatic pressure from the West, including the United States, in January of 1994, a trilateral statement was brokered between the United States, Russia, and Ukraine, which outlined a timetable for disarmament and dealt with the financial and security issues that Ukraine had raised. Overall, when it came to state building, Ukraine actually did a pretty decent job post-independence, building its own identity with respect to foreign policy, infrastructure for the economy, and building its own armed forces. The foreign policy was very much pro-Western, and it stressed that Ukraine was more European rather than Eurasian. And it had its contentious issues like the nuclear disarmament, and Russia still trying to exert some influence with respect to membership to the newly formed Commonwealth of Independent States and the status of Crimea, as well as control of the Black Sea. The interconnected issues of Crimea and the Black Sea Fleet constituted Ukraine's thorniest problems post-independence. Crimea, which constituted majority Russians, too had voted for an independent Ukraine, though not overwhelmingly. But post-independence, there was a little bit of disenchantment with independent Ukraine, and there was a push for greater autonomy for Crimea, and encouraged by some Russian politicians, even some brief talk of separation from Ukraine. And the dispute over the control of the Black Sea Fleet in Sevastopol, which was the Crimean port city, was another area of contention. Ukraine laid claim on the entire fleet, which had been an important military asset of the Soviet Union, and Russia responded saying that the fleet always had been and would remain Russia's. And finally, in 1997, Ukraine consented to allow Russia to acquire a majority share of the fleet in exchange for debt forgiveness, and a final agreement was reached which allowed Russia to lease the main port facilities of Sevastopol for 20 years. And subsequently, Ukraine and Russia signed the Treaty of Friendship, Cooperation and Partnership of 1997, which recognized Ukraine's territorial sovereignty and existing borders, including Crimea, and this helped calm the contentious issues to a great extent. In the 1994 presidential elections, Leonid Kuchma became the president and tried to conduct a policy of balancing relationships between the West and Russia. And in 1996, a new democratic constitution was adopted, and hryvnia was adopted as the national currency. And in 1999, a new variable came into the equation. Vladimir Putin became the new leader in Russia. Treaties and accords last as long as the signatories are in power. The 1997 treaty between Ukraine and Russia was signed when Boris Yeltsin was the president. However, the equation was going to change with Vladimir Putin taking over the reins in Russia. In the presidential election of 2004, President Leonid Kuchma was cleared by the Constitutional Court for a third term, but he endorsed the candidacy of Prime Minister Viktor Yanukovych, who was also strongly supported by Russian President Vladimir Putin. The leading opposition candidate was Viktor Yushchenko, who was running on an anti-corruption, anti-cronyism platform. But in September, Yushchenko's health suddenly began to fail. And later, medical tests revealed that he had suffered dioxin poisoning, which ultimately left his face disfigured. When Yanukovych was declared the winner, Viktor Yushchenko's supporters alleged fraud and staged mass protests that came to be known as the Orange Revolution. The protesters, clad in orange which was Yushchenko's campaign color, and took the streets. Ukraine during this time endured nearly 2 weeks of demonstrations. Ultimately, the Supreme Court declared the election invalid on December the 3rd and ordered a new runoff for December the 26th. This time, Yushchenko defeated Yanukovych by getting 52% of the vote. Yanukovych challenged the validity of the results, but Yushchenko was formally inaugurated on January the 23rd, 2005. By the next presidential election of January 2010, Yushchenko lost miserably with just 5% of the vote, and the top two candidates were Yanukovych and Yushchenko's former Prime Minister, Yulia Tymoshenko. Ultimately, Viktor Yanukovych became president. Yes, the same Viktor Yanukovych who was Putin's favorite candidate. Subsequently, in April of 2010, Ukraine agreed to extend Russia's lease of the port of Sevastopol in Crimea, which was originally set to expire in 2017, until 2042. In exchange, Ukraine would receive a reduction in the price of Russian natural gas. And then, in June of 2010, Ukraine officially abandoned its goal of joining NATO, a strategy that Russia had opposed vehemently. So at this point, you can see the Yanukovych government continuing to pivot towards Russia, and at this point, EU leaders start getting concerned about Ukraine. And all this came to a head in November of 2013, when a planned association agreement with the EU was abandoned just days before it was scheduled to be signed. The accord would have made Ukraine more closely integrated politically and economically with the EU. But Yanukovych came under intense pressure from Moscow and abandoned the signing of the agreement. And this triggered massive street protests, with crowds collecting in the Independence Maidan or Independence Square, and these protests came to be known as the Maidan protest movement. The protesters demanded the resignation of Yanukovych, but Russia tried to calm the protests by offering to cut the price of natural gas, and it purchased $15 billion in Ukrainian bonds to prop up the country's economy. Yanukovych signed a series of laws trying to restrict the right to protest, but that ended up encouraging the protesters even more. After several bloody encounters, a EU brokered agreement between President Yanukovych and the opposition leaders in February of 2014 called for early elections and the formation of an interim government. The parliament responded by approving the restoration of the 2004 constitution and thereby reducing the power of the Yanukovych presidency. With his power crumbling, Yanukovych fled the capital ahead of an impeachment vote, and subsequently Alexander Turchinov was appointed acting president. Meanwhile, Yanukovych resurfaced in Russia, and he delivered a defiant speech in Russian, insisting that he was still the rightful president of Ukraine. So Vladimir Putin sees his credibility and support erode in Ukraine, and what does he do? He moves Russian forces into Crimea under the pretext of protecting Russian citizens and military assets in Crimea. On March 6, 2014, the Crimean parliament voted to cede from Ukraine and join the Russian Federation, and the public referendum on the matter was scheduled for March 16, 2014. But on the day of the referendum, observers noted numerous irregularities in the voting process, including the presence of armed men at polling stations, and the result was an overwhelming 97% in favor of joining Russia. The result was rejected by Kiev, and it is here that the West, including the United States and the EU, imposed asset freezes and travel bans on numerous Russian officials and members of the Crimean parliament. And on March 21st, 2014, Putin signed a law formally integrating Crimea into Russia. And incidentally, on the same date, the interim government signed a portion of the association pact with EU that had been rejected by Yanukovych in November of 2013. The IMF also proposed an $18 billion loan package to help the Ukrainian economy that had been hit badly after the Maidan protests and the political turmoil. After the annexation of Crimea, Russians officially stated that they had no additional designs on Ukraine. However, in April of 2014, a NATO press briefing revealed the presence of an estimated 40,000 Russian troops in a state of high readiness just across Ukraine's border. And subsequently, pro-Russian armed groups started seizing parts of Donetsk and Luhansk regions close to the Russian border. In response, the Ukrainian government launched military operations. In July of 2014, Malaysian Airlines flight MH17 en route from Amsterdam to Kuala Lumpur was shot over Ukraine close to the Russian border, killing all the 283 passengers on board, including 80 children and 15 crew members. Investigations revealed that the plane had crashed after being hit by a Russian-made Buk missile, which had been brought in from Russian territory and was fired from a field controlled by the Russian-backed separatists. So why is Putin so obsessed with Ukraine? Just one acronym: NATO. Putin is demanding legal guarantees to ensure Ukraine does not join NATO or become a kind of an unofficial member hosting troops or defense infrastructure. He is most paranoid about NATO missiles pointing directly at Russia from across the border. With the collapse of the Warsaw Pact, following the collapse of the Soviet Union, NATO has expanded quite a bit in Europe and is virtually knocking at the Russian door. And Putin is hoping that the aggressive troop buildup on the Ukrainian border can be used as a bargaining chip to prevent Ukraine's entry into NATO. And on that note, we end this section of the program. On to the quiz section. Question from the previous episode. What city is considered the food capital of the world? With approximately 92% of its population eating out at a restaurant on average every week, Hong Kong is considered the food capital of the world currently. So the answer is A, Hong Kong. Question for today's episode. Under what scenario does Ukraine have a runoff election to decide its president? Is it A, too many candidates in the fray? B, no candidate has received 50% of the vote? C, claims of fraud in the primary election? Or D, all election results need to be ratified in a runoff? Once again, under what scenario does Ukraine have a runoff election to decide its president? A, too many candidates in the fray? B, no candidate has received 50% of the vote? C, claims of fraud in the primary election? Or D, all election results need to be ratified in a runoff? The answer will be provided in the next episode. That's all we have in today's episode. In the next episode, we travel back to India's partition and take a closer look at one of the many contentious issues coming out of the partition, Kashmir. Till then, stay safe and keep looking for the why in history.